house is only getting more expensive and more out of reach for many people here on the island. We're in a housing affordability crisis, but there are solutions to creating more livable, sustainable cities. To talk more about what those are, we're joined by Jennifer Keesmaat, CEO of the Keesmaat Group. Jennifer, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
Jennifer, you know all about housing. You're an urban planner. You spent 5 years as Toronto's chief city planner. You're on advisory boards in Canada and an international panel about urban redevelopment too. What is it about urban planning that made you want to do this as a career?
Well, it's kind of ironic because I first dipped my toe in the water many years ago back in Vancouver before I was even a planner. There's a building, the Woodwards building, that was very controversial at the time because it was going to be turned into a condo. And it was really a symbol of the transformation of the city and how many people were being pushed out of the city. And that was when I started to realize that how we use land, how we design space, determines whether or not we have a city where everyone belongs and where everyone has access to the housing that they need. So, it was really a recognition that, zoning and land use planning, it sounds really boring, but it's really at the heart of whether we're creating sustainable and civilized societies.
Now, you know the ins and outs of all of this. What kind of changes have you seen in urban design and planning over the past decade?
Well, I think some of the assumptions that were really foundational to urban planning when I first started in my career over 20 years ago, they're now starting to be questioned in a really substantive way. So, for example, the old model of urban planning was all about separating uses, putting housing in one area, culture, businesses, restaurant districts in a different area. This idea of separation has been very powerful, but it's led to all kinds of wonky outcomes, including the long commute, the notion that we have to travel vast distances for everyday life. Well, the wonderful thing about what's happening today is there's a recognition that when we mix up the uses, that we can really make our impact, our environmental impact, much, much smaller because we reduce the amount that we have to travel in our cities. So I would say that's one of the biggest ideas that's gone through a really big transformation over the course of my career and my professional life. And the good news is I used to talk about this stuff 20 years ago and people thought I was some kind of radical. And today people say, oh, I want to live in that kind of neighborhood. So we've gotten to a point where the commuting crisis is so great that there's an openness to change and an openness to designing our neighborhoods in a very different way.
That's really interesting. I never actually thought about it that way, but you're right. And we're also experiencing a housing affordability crisis on the island. Is this an issue that other cities in Canada are also facing? I mean, how big is this problem?
Well, this problem is very big in some ways because we've adopted very similar assumptions around how we use land and how we plan land across this entire country. Montreal is a real exception and Quebec City are exceptions, so I like to leave them out. But definitely in the vast majority of our cities and our large cities, we've basically taken a very large land area and we've reserved it for single-family homes. And the problem with that is that it makes providing infrastructure very costly. It means that most housing is in a very similar type of form, a single family home with a driveway with space for 2 cars. And that actually contributes to very high land costs, but also really high housing costs. So I'm a really big proponent that if we want new models of housing, we have to start with how we use land, and we have to use land in a very different way. We need co-ops. We need mid-rise buildings. We need gentle intensification in those existing neighborhoods, adding 4 and 5 and 6-story buildings in order to start adding more housing choice. So, how we use land, it sounds boring, but it's actually has a really practical implication in our everyday lives, and our policy frameworks are a real part of the problem.
So is that why we're in this situation that we are in this crisis?
Well, there's a whole variety of variables. You can't talk about access to housing without talking about low wages, because we've seen inflation for our costs of living. Every cost associated with living has gone up substantially, but wages have only increased approximately 4 to 5% over a 20-year period. So there's a mismatch. So I don't want to suggest that urban planning is the only part of the problem,
Right.
but it's actually a pretty big part of the problem. So we have to look at it from a variety of different perspectives.
You recently worked with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation on a report that had research on 4 municipalities, including Victoria. What did you find in that?
So we found out all kinds of fascinating things, but one of the most critical things that we revealed in the context of this solutions lab was that addressing how we deliver more affordable housing in cities is a financial problem, but it's also a design problem and it's a policy problem. So there's things that municipalities need to do. They need to upzone existing neighborhoods. They need to allow for gentle density, for the assembling of lots and the creation of mid-rise buildings, or walk-ups and triplexes and buildings of that nature. But we also need to think about housing in a different way. There's a great model that's being espoused in Vancouver where a group of families, so think of this for a minute, 12 families bought one bungalow, and then they redesigned a 3-story home that had spaces for each of the 12 families, and then it had shared spaces. So you can imagine a children's play area that was shared, a barbecue area that was shared, a workout room that was shared. That is a design solution that has financial implications. The cost is being spread over 12 families instead of one family. But the problem is the policy doesn't allow that. City planning policy doesn't allow that type of built form. So one of the things that was quite surprising to discover in this lab is that the challenges that we face in Canadian cities are very similar from one city to the next. And it goes back to the fact that we've reserved a tremendous amount of land for really only one type of housing, and that's a single family home. And we need to shake that loose. We need to add new forms of housing in new financial models, and we need to reimagine what that housing can look like if we're going to have housing that is affordable for absolutely everyone.
Mm-hmm. And Jennifer, you're also going to be a keynote speaker at an upcoming conference on Greater Victoria's economic future called Rising Economy Week. What will you be speaking about?
So I'll be speaking about exactly this. I'll be speaking about the need for imagination and new models, and the fact that we need to approach that through a variety of different lenses when it comes to planning and design. And part of that is a recognition that we begin to get really crazy, wonky outcomes when we don't provide housing for everyone. We, of course, start to see people sleeping in parks, people who no longer have shelter. We start to see that we can't attract many key workers who are needed to work in hospitals or who work retail or in the service industry. So I'll be talking a bit about the drivers behind why we need a new model, why everyone should care about this, because those wonky outcomes begin to affect everyone. If teachers can't afford to live in our communities, that's a really big problem. That means you start to have problems in the schools, and you start to have problems with having young families living in any given place. So I'll be talking about the solutions, but I'm also going to talk about some of the drivers that are behind why we need change, because I think that when we start thinking about it in that way, it really inspires motivation to see this as something that we can no longer ignore, something that we really must fix.
Right. And now this Rising Economy Week takes place this Monday to Thursday. And if you're interested in learning more about Jennifer's vision and work, you can still register online. Jennifer, thanks so much for taking the time. All the best.
My pleasure.